Topic 1.3 continues our discussion of biomes, but now gets into aquatic, water-based biomes. So there are slightly different factors which affect aquatic biomes that are different than some of those that affect terrestrial biomes. So salinity, how much salt is dissolved in the water, the depth of the water, turbidity means how clear the water is, how many nutrients are available in that water, the temperature of the water. All of those factors affect the type of biomes we find in aquatic ecosystems. So aquatic biomes cover 71% of the Earth's surface. We can split those biomes into freshwater biomes and marine biomes. Freshwater is water that is does not have much salt dissolved in it. Things like streams, rivers, ponds, lakes are freshwater biomes. We depend heavily on these freshwater biomes for drinking water for populations throughout the world. Marine biomes are biomes that do have more salt dissolved in them, varying levels of salt. This includes oceans, coral reefs, some coastal marshlands, and estuaries. And we know that the algae that are found in these marine biomes, especially the oceans, supplies the vast majority of the Earth's oxygen and also absorbs significant amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And these are important ecosystem services. Here we can see overall a map showing distribution of biomes, and we can see the vast majority are these open ocean pelagic zones, which is all this light blue. Okay, there are also areas of lakes that you can see, and rivers, areas of coral reefs in many different parts of the Earth, but you can see a lower variety of biomes that we find in aquatic ecosystems. So let's talk with streams and rivers first, freshwater biomes. Okay, and so streams and rivers we can break up into sort of the source zone where the beginnings of these streams and rivers start. They're often shallow, cold, clear, fast-flowing streams. Right? And generally cold water has high levels of dissolved oxygen, and we typically in these source areas have low nutrient levels. As we move through, as we follow these freshwater streams and rivers, downstream we get into a transition zone where generally the water's slow, they may be warmer with less dissolved oxygen, the stream bed may widen out, and eventually reach the floodplains where these streams and rivers empty into a lake or an ocean or something else, where we have the slowest water, warmest temperatures, lots of times high turbidity, okay, and the least amount of dissolved oxygen. If we think about the Earth and where various pools of water are, fresh water is only about 2.5% of the water that's found on the Earth. The rest is marine. Streams and rivers, we'll talk more detail about, exist within what we call a watershed, an area that collects water, bringing it into these streams. If we think about ponds and lakes, another freshwater ecosystem, what we see is different zones depending on depth. Typically along the shorelines, we see the shallow areas of water. This is often where there's the most light. There's lots of plants, plants that often are rooted to the bottom. Lots of biodiversity in these areas. Versus the open areas of the lake away from the shore where it's deeper. Okay, light only can penetrate so far. We might find floating plants here towards these limnetic zones, they're called. The top zone has lots of light available. And then we have the deeper areas where there's less light, less photosynthesis going on. Until we get to the very bottom, we call that the benthic zone, where really light doesn't penetrate. There's low dissolved oxygen, low photosynthesis, lots of decomposers. This refers to sort of the bottom of these ecosystems. We also have marshes, swamps, these floodplains along rivers, These are really important ecosystems. They're typically covered in water year-round or seasonally, where there's some submergence of the roots of plants. These are extremely productive ecosystems because water from nearby rivers and streams and lakes, for example, bring in nutrients as they flood and fill these marshes with water. And there's also typically a lot of sunlight available because there's not a big canopy shading these ecosystems. And it's critically important for lots of types of wildlife, things like birds, aquatic mammals. Fish rely on these often as breeding grounds. And so these wetlands, we call them, like marshes and swamps, for example, provide lots of important services for ecosystems. They help filter toxins out of the water. They can reduce the amount of flooding by absorbing water, preventing it from flooding settled areas during storms. They can provide a sustaining stream flow when there are dry conditions. They can help recharge groundwater, and they also help provide that biodiversity. And then we get to the marine ecosystems, the open ocean, which is 97.5% of the water on the earth. And within the open ocean, they again have several biomes. We have the zones, the intertidal zones, which are at the very edges. When you go to the beach, you're going to visit the intertidal zone of the ocean, where you have tides rising, you have wave action, okay? And in these areas, we have very high biodiversity, right? There's lots of nutrients there in these intertidal areas. Organisms living here have to adapt to, dry conditions during low tides, wet conditions during high tides. The action of waves and wind result in a high level of biodiversity. Then we have the coastal zones along the continental shelves. Okay, these are, again, pretty harsh conditions, not as high biodiversity as the intertidal zones. In the open ocean, we have the photic zone, which is at the top level, where there's a lot of sun and relatively low biodiversity. Okay, but it is very productive because we have lots of producers, that floating algae, plankton, which live on these huge areas that cover most of the earth, providing that oxygen in photosynthesis for the atmosphere, absorbing carbon dioxide. And then as we go deeper, we get less light available, we have less photosynthesis, less productivity. We also have the areas where we have what we call estuaries. These are some of the most diverse ecosystems, and includes things like salt marshes, mangrove forests, etc. These are areas where you have rivers dumping into the sea, and there's lots of nutrients from these rivers. The tidal fluctuations deposit nutrients on the floodplains along those rivers. There's lots of sunlight, very high productivity in these areas. There's also a mixture of, could be fresh and salt water. Where those two meet, we often call that brackish water. Brackish water has varying levels of salinity. For example, when the tide's going out in this tidal river, as the tide's going out, the fresh water makes its way further downstream. When the tide comes in and the ocean level rises, then that water becomes more saline and goes farther up the river because of that tidal action. We'll talk more about mangrove forests. These are types of aquatic marine ecosystems where the dominant tree are mangroves, called mangrove forests, and they are really important ecosystems for flood protection, for storm protection during tropical storms and hurricanes, but they are in danger because of human activities as well. And these mangrove forest trees are adapted to living in salt water. They have roots often elevated above the ground to obtain oxygen. They're uniquely adapted species. Like you see here, these mangrove forests, we have these prop roots holding the trees up. Those prop roots are what can do a great job providing habitat for species fish and other aquatic species, and absorbing the energy of storms as they make their way onto shore. You also have what I was speaking of before, the intertidal zone, the narrow band along the coast between high and low tides where you go to the beach. Typically, these can be steep and rocky areas. They can be challenging for species to live in because you are exposed to the elements during low tide. You're flooded during high tide. There is the action of waves beating against the shore. So we have lots of highly specialized species that live in those intertidal zones. And then, of course, we have our coral reefs. Coral reefs are found in warm, shallow oceans. You can see a picture here at the bottom of a variety of corals. The water here in coral reefs is relatively low in nutrients, and it's dominated by these animals we call coral. Coral is an organism, a symbiotic organism that lives with a type of algae within its cells. And the algae provide nutrients for the coral to consume. Okay? And the coral provides a living space for those algae. So we have this symbiotic relationship. And those coral form these skeletons, these calcium-based skeletons that we see when we look at a coral reef. A coral reef is a collection of corals. And each coral organism is made of many of these things called polyps, okay, that form the organism. And it's very high in productivity and extremely biodiverse. Coral reefs are some of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. Here we can see the anatomy of these coral. We could see they have tentacles with stinging cells. This is their digestive cavity where materials can be consumed. And those coral are under duress, mainly from climate change and ocean acidification.